Donald Trump's voter base is increasingly frustrated with him and other prominent figures in the MAGA movement like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're beginning to feel betrayed by policies and priorities that don't align with the promises made during campaigns. The sentiment is clear in statements like, "This is not what we voted for," as former Trump supporters lament the lack of focus on key issues like lowering costs and improving economic conditions. Instead of addressing these concerns, the focus of MAGA figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene seems to be on issues that many Americans view as distractions. For example, Greene has recently criticized young women who make money on platforms like OnlyFans, calling it repulsive and sick. Instead of tackling issues like rising costs or education reform, the MAGA agenda appears to prioritize cultural grievances, including discussions about transgender athletes or personal morality, rather than fulfilling campaign promises. This disconnect is evident in areas like Kentucky, where voters are now reckoning with the real-world consequences of Trump's policies. Tom Gabriel, the superintendent of Bell County Schools in Kentucky, expressed concern over proposed federal education funding cuts. He acknowledged that these cuts, if enacted, would devastate his schools. Gabriel said, "I don't think that anyone in our country wants to cut our school funding," highlighting the growing gap between campaign rhetoric and the lived experiences of Trump's base. Yet, Trump's consistent stance on eliminating the Department of Education, a stance he's reiterated numerous times in speeches, shows that these cuts are exactly what he's promised. Trump's speeches have repeatedly targeted the Department of Education, with quotes like, "I will shut down the federal Department of Education," and "We will break up the Department of Education soon." For years, Trump and his surrogates have called for dismantling federal funding for education. Despite these clear signals, many voters seem blindsided by the potential consequences, such as overcrowded classrooms, teacher layoffs, and reduced resources for vulnerable students. This policy trajectory highlights a broader trend of MAGA initiatives disproportionately harming Trump's own voter base. A CNN analysis revealed that the 15 states most dependent on federal school funding overwhelmingly supported Trump in the last election. Cutting these funds would have catastrophic effects on these communities, yet these voters are only now recognizing the risks of such policies. Another example is the Trump administration's stance on education vouchers and school choice. These initiatives, while marketed as empowering parents, often redirect public funds away from public schools and into private or for-profit institutions. Critics argue this approach undermines public education and disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. If we start putting public money in private schools, they become public schools, one expert said, emphasizing the need to protect taxpayer dollars for public education improvement rather than privatization. In addition to education, Trump's policies have consistently prioritized the interests of corporations and the wealthy over working-class Americans. His tax cuts for billionaires have done little to alleviate economic pressures for the average Trump voter. Meanwhile, tariffs, which were supposed to boost American manufacturing, have often backfired, increasing costs for consumers and hurting farmers and small businesses. The dismantling of social safety nets like Medicaid, food stamps, and veterans' benefits further exacerbates these issues, as many of these programs are lifelines for Trump's base in red states. Compounding these policy failures is Trump's disregard for fiscal responsibility, as seen in his campaign's unpaid bills to cities hosting his rallies. In St. Cloud, Minnesota, Trump's campaign left the city with a $29,000 tab for a rally that drew 8,000 supporters. Local officials expressed frustration, noting the strain on city resources and the lack of accountability from the campaign. This pattern is repeated across the country, with Trump's campaign owing millions to various cities. The response from Trump's team has been dismissive, blaming entities like the Secret Service for these debts, despite clear evidence to the contrary. These issues highlight a recurring theme. The MAGA movement's priorities and policies often fail to deliver tangible benefits for its supporters. Instead, cultural grievances and divisive rhetoric dominate the agenda, leaving critical issues like healthcare, education, and economic stability unaddressed. This disconnect is reflected in Trump's declining approval ratings, which hit a historic low before his inauguration. In summary, the frustration among Trump voters stems from unfulfilled promises and policies that harm the very communities that propelled him to power. Whether it's education cuts, economic policies favoring the wealthy, or unpaid bills that burden local taxpayers, the consequences of the MAGA agenda are becoming increasingly clear. As Trump's base begins to reckon with these realities, the cracks in his coalition are widening. Moving forward, it remains to be seen how these voters will respond and whether they will hold Trump and his allies accountable for their actions.